Okay, so I was going to start the session today with a run through of the consultation and the time scales for implementation of the new regulatory system. And then we'll go on to talk about the conditions of funding and how those apply to school sixth forms and then to adult and community learning. And then we'll talk a bit about the monitoring of the compliance with the new regulatory system and the kind of operational implications and how we can work with you going forward to kind of make it work for both of us. So that's the kind of rough outline of the session, and then we've got any other business at the end if anyone wants to raise anything. But if we can start off by going through and talking about the consultation and the timelines. So the consultation itself, you'll have seen the documents which are on Medr's website. So there's an overarching consultation document which includes all the questions we're asking, and that links then through to an online survey. In addition to that, so that's the actual consultation document itself, but the actual documents we're consulting on. So within those, there's the regulatory framework, which is the key document that sets out our approach to regulation and how that then articulates into how we're going to monitor compliance, and also it sets out the requirements of each of the conditions of funding. Now, many of you might have responded to the first consultation we held between May and July, and in that consultation we put out the drafts of the first batch of conditions of funding. This consultation is, whilst it's focusing on the second batch of conditions, it actually does include all the conditions. So the regulatory framework you've got there is the entirety of the framework. It's the complete piece. So as I say, within that, it includes a high-level statement of our regulatory approach and also on our approach to monitoring compliance with the conditions, and that includes also how we might be expected to escalate to intervention if that was required, although of course we hope we don't ever go there. So as well as the regulatory framework, within the pack of documents, we've also got our statement of intervention powers, which is a statutory document we have to produce. Really, that's about how we can formally intervene when things go wrong. But of course, in terms of formal powers, we'd only ever use those if things were seriously wrong, I would say. And we would always look to try and resolve things, through kind of dialogue with providers rather than heading into intervention territory. But they're there in the toolbox should we ever need to use them. But so I won't say much more about those for now. The quality framework is another key document. You will have seen that previously. We have made changes to that document on the back of feedback from the first consultation. So that is the kind of latest version you've got there. And then in terms of other documents, we've got the learner engagement code, which is something which clearly we'll touch on today. And that is a key document that you're seeing for the first time. And my colleagues Kieran and others will touch on that later. Also within the pack of documents, there's a set of frequently asked questions. It isn't exhaustive, and we tried to sort of think of more obvious questions. But what I would say, if there are any questions which come out of this session and also questions which came out of our face-to-face sessions last week and the week before, we may well feed some of those into the FAQs down the line. So what we'll probably do is build up a kind of pack of questions which will expand over time as people ask new things. We'll try and answer them. So the FAQs are there, and then also there's a glossary of terms, and I'm very conscious that different types of providers use different terms and all sorts of disagreements on what to call certain things. So we've basically picked various terms and we've included them in the documentation, and we've clarified what we may mean by them. Again, that might not be exhaustive. There may well be things that you think should also be in there. So please, if you do find anything, I know this is part of the consultation, but both the FAQs and the glossary will likely be put on our website in the longer term, so they'll be there as a kind of an ongoing resource. That's my kind of take on it. So I think any feedback you've got on there, if we're missing anything, please let us know. So that's the actual documents. In terms of the consultation process, this, as I said, this is the second of two consultations. We had an 8-week consultation between May and July of this year. So this consultation started on 22nd of October and it runs through till the 17th of December. We are working to an exceptionally tight timescale in terms of implementation, and actually to a large part that's actually linked with requirements in respect of the higher education sector and the fact that those providers will need to be entered onto our register, and we are effectively using the conditions of funding and conditions of registration. They are the same conditions for the most part, so rather than drafting sort of separate batches of conditions, we've done it in a kind of a holistic way. We are trying to work on a tertiary basis, so hence the conditions are drafted at quite a high level. They're not, if you were to look at them as a university, for example, they wouldn't necessarily be sort of zeroed in on exactly how you'd work as an organization, and exactly the same for yourselves as providers of adult and community learning. They are drafted at quite a high level, so they're kind of principal type level. So those so the consultation process, as I say, runs through till just before Christmas. In January, we will be taking stock of all the feedback we get, and we will need to do that pretty sharpish, because I would like to have most revisions completed by early February, because we have a number of internal processes we've got within Medr. There's a little bit of flex in there, but not much. Ultimately, the whole of the regulatory framework needs to be finalized by March. And so basically we have a board meeting in March. So the final version of the regulatory framework and all the various documents will go to board for sign off for publication in March. I think when we will then publish those documents in early April, legally we can't do it until our powers go live. And I think that's on the 6th of April, though the 6th I think is Easter Monday. So it's going to be it won't be on Easter Monday. We'll be publishing them probably on the 7th, I would imagine. So that's the plan. And again, some of that links with the fact that higher education institutions will need to apply for registration, and that process needs to happen before August of next year. So from your perspective, you obviously that doesn't apply to you. It will be a case of as you're funded, you will just then be subject to the new conditions, and we will clearly, those new conditions will be conditions of funding will be published along with the application process for registered providers in early April. Now, that's the kind of the regulatory framework and other kind of key regulatory documents. There is still a lot of other stuff to be worked through, particularly in respect of monitoring, and we'll talk about that later. But I think a lot of that, will be stuff we'll need to work with you on. And I'm very conscious, because a lot of what we've got is cast at quite a high level. What it means for me will be very different for different types of providers, and so there are conversations need to be had about that. I think really from now onwards, and I think in terms of operationalizing some of the arrangements, we really do want to work with you to get to a stage where it's not overly burdensome. Okay, so that's all I was going to say on the on the consultation process and timeline, there are a couple of kind of things we are checking with lawyers in respect of timelines, and one of those is in respect of the learner engagement code. And effectively the Act says that once it's published, effectively the governing bodies of schools with sixth forms will then have a statutory duty to comply from that point onwards, and we will have a statutory duty to monitor from that point onwards. And I know this doesn't directly apply to yourselves, because this applies actually on the schools themselves in this case, because it's a statutory duty on their governing body. But there is an issue there about how we publish the learner engagement code, because actually it won't go live for providers like registered providers of higher education, for example, until 1st of August 2026, when they go onto the register. So what we don't want is it kind of going live piecemeal for different types of providers. In an ideal world, we'd like it to all go live from the 1st of August of next year. So we are having conversations with our lawyers about, can we publish the document as a kind of a draft or a kind of a pre version of the code, if you know what I mean, so you know what it looks like, but it's not the official version. So there's kind of some conversations going on there, and I don't know where that's going to end up. So I think clearly we'll need to iterate with yourselves on some of that. So that's all I was going to say on timelines. Has anyone got any questions on timelines before we move on to talk about conditions? No? Okay. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Kieran Rees. Kieran, over to you to talk about conditions with regard to school sixth forms.
Diolch, Ewan. Prynhawn pawb. I'm Kieran Rees. I'm Director of Learning Experience at Medr. So in terms of the regulatory approach and the conditions in relation to sixth forms, there's two main areas to discuss, and they're quite different, and Ewan has touched on both briefly already, so I'll expand a little bit, but we will have some time for questions. And we've got the leads, our leads for quality and learner engagement here as well, who can sort of expand, respond to any kind of particular areas of detail you want to know more about. If I start with quality, so as Ewan mentioned, our condition on quality and continuous improvement is one of our regulatory conditions which will apply to sixth forms via local authorities. So it will be a condition of funding for the funding we pass on to local authorities. It's worth having a look through the consultation specifically at this section, but essentially what the condition says is providers must demonstrate good quality provision and engage in continuous improvement. And then what it sets out is the ways in which we will look to understand whether provision meets the requirements of that condition. And the three main vehicles we set out for monitoring and understanding are, and this won't surprise you, Estin inspection or QAA review. I think in the case of sixth forms, it's Estin inspection. The use of performance data, so understanding what performance data looks like, and then broader intelligence that we may receive as well. And those are the things that will factor into our consideration of compliance with the condition. What happens if there's a concern, or if we think there's a risk to adequate quality? That's when we go into what Ewan set out, which is the step ladder of engagement, starting with, in almost every case, an informal conversation to try and understand some of the context that might be giving rise to that concern. Paired with the quality condition is our quality framework, and this is something that's set out in our legislation as a thing that we can develop to use to offer guidance and information on policy and practice. So effectively, what the quality framework does is it describes some of the ways in which providers can evidence or demonstrate good quality, and many of the pillars that make up that framework won't be surprising. They include externality, self-evaluation, professional learning, and so on. In time, so one of the things that's set out within our legislation is that Estin needs to have due regard to our quality framework through the development of their own practice, and so we would expect over time to see a coalescing around some common areas, I think, between the existing frameworks and the quality framework itself, which does need to operate at an overarching tertiary level. So that's quality. The other big area is learner engagement. And as Ewan mentioned, this is a statutory duty that's placed on maintained schools that have sixth forms. So they have a statutory requirement to comply with the Learner Engagement Code, the draft of which has been consulted on as part of the overall package. It's focused around a set of principles that we see as being the common areas that all learners in Wales should be able to expect in terms of engagement. It's worth clarifying because I think the Act defines learner engagement in a way that for some is perhaps counterintuitive. It isn't around engagement in teaching and learning. It is around learners being engaged in decision making that affects them. So it is around the ways in which you are able to engage learners in institutional decision making, and that's what the principles of the code are structured around. As you'd expect, the code again has to operate on a tertiary level. So what it really does is try to do is boil down to essential principles, what we think are the common expectations. In terms of monitoring, our current thinking, and something we're very keen to test with partners and through the consultation, is around requiring those subject to the code to provide succinct evidence on the ways in which learner engagement in decision making has had an impact in that institution. Currently, we'd be expecting that to sort of be operating on the individual school level, but I know many of you maybe there's probably a conversation to be had around what the role is of the local authority in that space. When it comes to sixth forms and the regulatory framework, I think those are the two main areas, and the big distinction is quality is a condition, a regulatory condition of funding that applies to the local authority, and is very much tied in with things such as ESTA inspection and data, whereas the Learner Engagement Code is a duty on schools attached to our code, which has high-level principles and through which we are required to do a certain amount of monitoring in relation to it. Happy to take any questions on those areas in relation to sixth forms. Rob.
Thanks, Kieran. Rob Hillier, Pembrokeshire Local Authority. I've just got a question around the informal consultation, Kieran. I'm assuming, is that directly with yourselves? And if so, when is that likely to take place? In the autumn term, or once sort of triple SPs and everything else have been published?
Sorry, informal consultation in relation to what?
To quality.
Oh, so the quality framework and condition are part of the consultation that's currently out, that was published on the 22nd of October.
Yeah, yes, but in terms of what you're proposing, when do you think that the consultation with providers is likely to take place with sixth forms?
So the consultation is the consultation, as in our quality requirements are set in the consultation. Are you talking more generally about engagement with sixth forms?
Apologies. Yeah, it's as part of the quality process. Once everything's through the hoops and we're in the live system, if a sixth form has poor results, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts in terms of how the discussion might happen and when that might happen within an academic year, within an academic cycle.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I see you're talking about the system being in place. What did that engagement with sixth forms look like? I'll bring in my colleague Cleona in a moment, but my sense is that our funding relationship is with the local authority. So I think where there were concerns, our primary conversation would need to be with the local authority. Presumably, I'd imagine in practice, a lot of the local authorities would want to coordinate that conversation in line with the school. I suspect there are two factors. I think we are generally looking at a sort of a provider risk review cycle, which you might be able to speak a bit more to in a moment, and that will inform our engagement at different points, and it's built very much around an annual assurance return. You might want to touch on that a bit more in a moment. But specifically around quality, some of that will also depend when we get things like inspection reports and things such as that as well. Cleo, do you want to speak a bit more on that first?
Yeah, sure. I think as Kieran said, once the outcomes of inspections are published, we may look to engage. I mean, we do take Eston as being the lead in that. So, for example, if a local authority goes into follow-up, we just really monitor what's going on. Eston keep us in the loop. We make sure that we're having joined-up conversations, that there's not lots of duplication of requirements. So, in fact, you probably won't notice us in terms of the engagement following, say, a poor inspection outcome. We'll just be making sure that we're well informed. In terms of data, it'll be around the publication of the data. We're trying to sort of automate a lot of our analysis, and then it's trying to look at that at local authority level and at school level. We're still working through this, so I think it'll be a while before we get there. But essentially, as Kieran said, our engagement will be with you rather than with the schools directly. And I think a lot of it is about trying to understand the reasons behind data. So, for example, some local authorities will be very impacted by rurality. Others might have a big pulse of care leavers or refugees or so on. So it's really about understanding the reasons behind the data and the challenges there. It's not immediately saying data is bad, must take action. I think it's about having that conversation, understanding what the problem is and how we might be able to support you in addressing that and trying to improve it. But we're very happy to engage with you on an ad hoc basis if you've got queries, want a discussion and so on as well. We've been engaging with various local authorities and stuff around the country. Do feel free to drop us a line if you want a conversation, and we can either come visit or have a chat on Teams or whatever might help your understanding of it.
Thanks, Cleo. And you, do you want to talk a little bit about the annual assurance cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk about this later, actually.
Okay, so we'll come back to it.
So we've got later on, we talk about monitoring shortly, but just to say that, you know, Kieran mentioned a provider risk assessment. So as part of our overall sort of packaging monitoring arrangements, one of the things we will do internally is a kind of a risk assessment of all providers. Now, it's something we are going to pilot with FE and HE in the first instance. So I'm not sure whether it'll go beyond that or not. It's something we probably need to have a conversation about, and we will come out and consult on it once we've got it sort of ready to go. So that will be at some point, I think, in the first half of next year. We'll probably come out and consult on that process. But I think in the first instance, certainly we won't be piloting it with local authorities or school sixth forms. I mean, that will be down the line, I think. And it might be that the consultation suggests it's not going to be appropriate anyway. So we'll have to have that conversation. But effectively, it's a kind of a holistic assessment of risk of non-compliance. And that would certainly, with some providers, would actually inform how we go about monitoring, so we can kind of keep our kind of approach live and kind of not overly burden those who are basically not at risk particularly. So but we'll come and talk about monitoring shortly. I'll pass back to you, Kieran.
Thanks you. I hope that helps, and I suppose some of it might be clarified further in the next conversation, in the later conversation around monitoring. Vicky.
Thanks, Kieran. I was at the in-person meeting last week, if you remember, in Llandudno. So, you know, really useful to have time to reflect on this. I suppose we had a conversation about the statutory duty sitting with governing bodies around the learner engagement code. So, you know, if that proceeds, I suppose my question is, will there be professional development for governing bodies in terms of, you know, the expectations around that, and where will the regulatory requirement for that sit? I suppose, does that sit with yourselves as Medr? Will it sit with us as local authorities? And I suppose my plea would be, if it does eventually sit with us as local authorities, an understanding from Medr in terms of our capacity to take on new additional responsibilities. I think that needs to be part of the conversation, because if it becomes a new statutory duty for governing bodies, I think we need to understand that there will need to be a training requirement for governors as well.
So I suppose to clarify, it is a statutory duty. It's in the existing Act from 22. Yeah, but it only comes live when we publish the learner engagement code. So just for clarity, there's no question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I've confused myself there, Kieran. Thank you.
That's okay. in terms of school governance, I think I'm correct in saying, we've got very limited locus in relation to maintain school governance.
Yeah. Yes, but that's not to say that, it might be that it's appropriate to do something in that space. We need to have a think about it. And actually, I think it's a broader question. Actually, it's not just schools. We were asked actually about governance in terms of FE as well. So, I mean, maybe we need to think about something in terms of that space. But
I can see Marion might want to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Hi, Vicky. This
Marion.
is something that's on our radar, actually, but we're really conscious that we haven't really done any direct engagement with sixth form schools, with sixth forms as yet. We're starting that tomorrow, and certainly not with governing bodies. But yeah, absolutely, this is the one area where that direct statutory duty does rest with school governing bodies. So absolutely, it's on our radar that we do need to do something by way of training and awareness raising for governing bodies on the learner engagement code. That is on our to-do list amongst quite a range of areas where we think we're going to need to do some additional guidance and resources to help tailor the requirements of the code to different settings. In terms of, you mentioned local authority capacity, that's something we're really conscious of on the learner engagement code. We're aware that the monitoring of learner engagement, school councils, isn't necessarily something that local authorities are actively engaged in at the moment. So we have not set any expectations of local authorities fulfilling a particular support role for schools at the moment. But this is something we're interested in getting views on through events like this and through our consultation to understand whether there is scope for any kind of coordinating type of a role for local authorities here. And we're really open to feedback and discussion on that, but we're not making any assumptions at this stage about that capacity.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Tim?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Tim Opie from the Welsh Local Government Association. To expand on the point that Vicky's made, really, throughout the consultation document on the Learner Engagement Code, there are references to student unions and events and conferences that take place at FE and HE level to support and, in fact, training that's provided for young people. That doesn't exist in sixth forms either. So the associate governors, the young people that sit on the governing bodies, will there be training made available to them as well? Can be quite a daunting environment for them to be in. So far as I'm aware, there isn't anything available at the moment. I know in the school that I'm a governor at, I've asked there, and they said no, anything that's done is done from a teacher by just supporting them in that way. So if sixth form young people can tap into whatever systems and processes are available currently, I think that would be really beneficial.
Thank you, Tim. Any thoughts on that, Marion?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because obviously for schools there are statutory requirements around school councils and associate pupil governors. Medr doesn't own that. That's a Welsh government owned piece of legislation or set of legislation, as you'll be aware, Tim. So I think there's an interesting topic for us to discuss with Welsh Government about what's required in that area and where responsibilities there. We're very mindful of trying to make sure that the learner engagement code is broad enough that it can work for the different settings and learners and structures and requirements. So of course, yeah, in some parts of the sector there are very established representation structures such as students' unions. That's not the case everywhere. That's not even the case across further education. There are sectors like adult community learning, apprenticeships, where there isn't that. So it's a real mixed picture. What we're doing at the moment is trying to create the code so that it's broad enough and flexible enough to work in all of those different environments. I've got no doubt that further requests and needs will come out of the implementation of the code in terms of that type of training and support. And yeah, we're open to considering all of that. But in the case of school councils and associate pupil governors, we do need to look at how that fits with the Welsh Government statutory requirements. I can see that in the chat somebody's suggestion that the learner engagement code is very FE and HE heavy. It isn't meant to be. So what we're very keen to have is explicit feedback through the consultation on what exactly are you seeing in there that's making it seem unbalanced, where could the school requirements be clearer, and we're very keen to generate examples and case studies to include with the code to help illustrate how it can work in school settings and other settings as well. So I think there's some more work for us to do there, but we're going to be hopefully able to turn to you to be able to help us to generate some of that content. Sorry, Tim, that was a bit of a rambling answer, but I hope it was some help.
No, just to throw in for consideration as well, and I'm sure it wouldn't have escaped your attention, but you know, if there was a system in place whereby sixth form associate governors were able to tap into that, there are other obvious learning experiences to come from that as well, not just training to sit on governing bodies, but if they're engaging with other FE and possibly HE work-based learning, well, you know, colleagues as well, they can learn a lot more about each other's settings, the governance, you know, and other informal learning opportunities.
Thanks, Tim. Marion, there's also a question on time scales. So how much time will be given to school governing bodies to provide evidence to Medr in terms of the implementation of the code? Am I right in assuming it's probably the same as the wider cycle, which would mean the first sort of submission would be autumn 27?
Yes, that's correct.
So we're some time away. Gail.
O, diolch yn fawr. Gail Shenton, Pennaeth Dysgu and Pen y Bont. I'm Head of Learning at Bridgend. My first question came to the point you said earlier, Kieran, that you hoped that Estyn would be able to engage with you and work alongside you with this. I just wondered if you had, I'm hoping that that's already happened, I suppose, and that they are aligned with you and they are, you know, working alongside you. That's my first question.
So sorry, I should have been clear. What I meant, yeah, we work very closely with Estyn. From next year, we'll have the funding responsibility for Estyn and the remit-led responsibility. And we've had a lot of Estyn involvement in the development of the quality condition and in the development of the framework itself. What I was referring to is over time, we would expect to see a coalescing around our quality framework across the different aspects of tertiary quality provision, because that's something that's set out in the Act. So we work very closely with Estyn, but I just think in time what we'll see is a more of a permeation of the quality framework through more visibly, I think, through various things such as inspection frameworks.
Yeah, because what we don't want is our sixth forms to see it as something separate, isn't it? We want you to be seen together. Okay, and then my second point, really, just building on what Sarah, my colleague, has said, actually, when we're thinking that this will become statutory for governors in August 26, I suppose it's a request, really, that the governing body training would be in place before that, so that they understand their statutory duties and what we would be expecting of them. Because although August 27 feels like a long way away, time flies when you're having fun. So, you know, I'd like for them to be able to feel that they know what they're doing and what the expectations are before it's a statutory expectation of them.
Great, thank you, Gail.
Diolch.
Noted, diolch. Great. Any other comments on sort of specifically, I think, in relation to the sixth form elements before we move on to talk about, I think, next on the agenda is the ALS, adult community learning elements. Humphrey, sorry, I don't know your first name.
Sorry, it's
oh no, it's yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. It was myself that was putting the questions into the chat. But just one thing for me in terms of data. Now, the term data is very broad. Cleo alluded to the fact that more work needed to be done around this. From a local authority perspective, in terms of, for example, AS and A-level results, we only get what WJEC published to us. Now, that isn't a huge amount of data for us, and to be able to say that there's no improvement in a school just on a set of WJC qualifications, for me is a little bit worrying, especially if we're looking at quality and, you know, the continuous improvement, as you alluded to, Kieran, at the start. What does that data look like? Have you got any ideas in terms of what you would be coming to the local authority to ask for? Because we haven't got a great amount of academic data. Thank you.
So I'll bring Cleo in a moment, but I think just to reflect, for the most part, we're talking about existing data sources. Although with some sort of further developments along that, one of the things that's set out in our strategic plan is a commitment within the first 2 years to consult. Sorry, one sec.
It's okay.
To consult on the development of performance measures. Some of the, so firstly, I think broadly our approach is going to be consulted on. There are, just to reassure, we're not looking at something very kind of reductive just around, say, A-level attainment. I think we're looking at how we take a more holistic consideration of performance, and there'll be a lot of different factors that I suspect Cleo's going to talk about in a moment in that, including, for example, it may be around things such as the S to A2 progression, or other measures of retention as well. Cleo.
Yeah, I think it's back down to our focus on being proportionate. We're recognising that in some cases, in some schools, that the numbers of sixth form students are quite small, and actually small changes to numbers can have big impacts in terms of data. So we're not planning just sort of sweep in and have a set percentage which will trigger hell and mayhem. It's very much about the conversations and understanding about how the needs of the learners in the area can be met most holistically, and going through that. Our thematic review for Eston for next year is looking at progression from AS to A2, and that's really to help us understand some of the factors around those decision-making processes. And again, I mentioned earlier, things like rurality, how easy it is for them to get to FE versus to sixth form, is going to have a huge impact. So we're very much focused on the fact that there isn't a single right answer that fits everybody, and we've got to be very much looking at the context. So I think we'll always be looking to have conversations, and then really it's about looking at the best outcomes for those learners and how they can be met within the sort of resources, the location, and various constraints available. So please be assured we will be having conversations rather than wandering around saying you're below such and such a percentage, let us take our big sticks out. So it's conversations really is where and this is what we will use then to help shape our understanding of how we use performance indicators in the future, and that's really about understanding the performance of tertiary education in Wales as a whole, and recognising that, you know, each part of Wales is so hugely different, and county councils, local authorities are hugely different in terms of size and nature. So we're very, very conscious of that, but we're also very aware that we need to be having lots more conversations with you about all this. It's just that it's taken us quite a while to sort of get to the point where we know enough about what we're doing, and to be able to sort of explain to you our thoughts and processes. Do please take us up on the offer to have conversations about it. It'll help shape
January. So
brilliant.
More then.
But it'll help shape our ideas as we go into the next round of development as well. So it's very, very helpful for us too. Thanks.
And just a bit of feedback as well from when I went to the in-person consultation meeting in Cardiff, that if there are any concerns that do actually come up, you're not going to go straight to the schools, you're going to speak to the local authority in the first instance. And I think that's really a key point in supporting the schools rather than them having that initial conversation. So
I mean, it's different between quality and the learner engagement code. And Marion might want to come back on the learner engagement code because the duties sit differently. Yes. But certainly for quality, we see it as the responsibility line with the local authority, because that's the organisation we fund, and therefore that's the route that we take. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks very much.
That's who our relationship is primarily with. Great. Any other questions on the sixth form aspects that we've raised so far? Okay, so you always expect someone to put like a hand at the last moment. I'll hand back to you and to start discussing some of the areas of relevance to adult community learning.
Well, so I only have one or two areas I want to cover briefly. I mean, you may well have seen the first consultation, and you'll know if you contributed to responding to the first consultation, that we had a number of conditions in there which will apply to yourselves for adult and community learning. So I'm thinking particularly financial sustainability, governance and management, for example, are critical ones. Now, in respect of Medr as an organisation, we have a statutory duty to report on financial sustainability of HE and FE. That doesn't really apply to yourselves. So we've got to work out, I think, from an operational perspective, what our kind of oversight of financial sustainability actually looks like with local authorities, because I mean, effectively, you're monitored anyway on that kind of thing. So but there's a bit of kind of pragmatism, I think, needed in terms of that particular condition. And likewise with governance and management, I can't imagine we're going to do much in that space either. So, but just to say, they do form part of the overall set of conditions, and they do apply to adult and community learning. And of course, not every set of adult and community learning is actually led by a local authority. There is at least one area in Wales where it's led by the local FE college. So clearly there'll be a very different engagement there. So as well as those sort of conditions which we consulted on earlier in the year, and so quality was one of those. As well as those, there is also a condition in respect of information assistance and access, which is effectively a condition related to if we need to get information from you, or we need to send someone in to look at something. So I'm thinking Estin obviously have got powers in their own right, but were we to need to send I don't know, some auditors in or whatever, in that circumstance, it's really a condition then which gives us the power to sort of say, you need to do that to comply with the condition. You need to work with them, and to a certain extent, it's a condition which I think has been there in conditions of funding previously as a kind of a standard thing. So it's really there just to make sure that people supply information which they're asked for, and that they just cooperate with us, really. So I think it's kind of pretty much a standard condition. Obviously, it's slightly different in that you are local authorities, and there's a different context to it. And I think that's the point with a number of the conditions. Actually, it's like how we actually apply them with you. It might be slightly different, so we need to have a conversation with you about kind of what monitoring expectations will be. I think that's a general point actually with all providers, actually not just with yourselves, but what you're looking at in the current consultation is the framework. Actually, the kind of mechanics on the ground of how we monitor compliance with that framework is something we need to work out with yourselves, and we're very keen to do that, actually, because I think that will look different for different types of providers. So obviously for yourselves as local authorities, it'll look very different to what we ask from a university or an FE college, so or a private apprenticeship provider for that matter. So yeah, it will. There'll be a lot of differences there. So I think we need your input to that to make sure that our monitoring processes are practical for you. They give us what we need by way of assurance, and they don't overly burden you either. So that was probably all I was going to say on the conditions I wanted to cover. Kieran, I mean, there's a number of other ones, but I don't want to go into too much detail on them. I think the key ones probably are the ones in the latest consultation. So if I pass back to you, Kieran, is that okay?
Thanks, Ewan. I'll talk briefly through the 6 new conditions from our area, one of which we've touched on already, which is the Learner Engagement Code. But I think I need to preface this with the recognition that I think when it comes to our community learning, we're going to really need to make sure we do take a proportionate approach, because the system as set out in the consultation is extensive, and we do need to recognise the relative, I think, scale and funding behind our community learning. But that said, effectively, the conditions I'm about to describe do apply to all of our funded provision, with the exception, as we said, out of sixth forms, and that does include adult community learning. Many of them are the result, and those of you who've been to any of the in-person events, I'm going to apologise now, there's going to be a little bit of repetition. But also, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on these because will be separate sort of deep dive online opportunities for those of you who want to know more about specific conditions. But generally, pretty much nearly all of them arise out of statutory obligations on us. For example, the equality of opportunity condition, which requires all funded providers to deliver measurable outcomes to support equality of opportunity. And that would involve, for example, increasing participation of those from underrepresented groups, improving completions from those from underrepresented groups, and addressing attainment gaps where those gaps arise out of social, cultural, or economic factors. That condition requires the delivery of measurable outcomes to address those things. And Medr would expect to be submitted as part of the annual assurance return details of what those measurable outcomes are. That condition actually is a little different to all of our other ones, as that one, the equality of opportunity condition, comes in 27, 28, so a year after most of the other ones. Well, Sam would pull me up, I'm sure, in a moment, because it does come in 26, 27, but that is set out clearly as a transition year within the condition itself, and the actual requirements come in 27, 28. I think in a similar vein, we also have the learner and staff welfare condition, which requires us to be satisfied about provider arrangements, the effectiveness of provider arrangements for supporting learner and staff welfare, with a focus on process, procedure, and support. And at the heart of that condition is the expectation that those that we fund carry out a self-evaluation to identify their risk areas and gaps, and then go through a priority setting process to set out how they're going to address those gaps. We've touched on the learner engagement code already, but that condition also applies to adult community learning. We also have a condition on complaints. We're under a duty to be assured of that providers have in place complaints processes and that they publicise those complaints processes. So learner complaints specifically in the event of an act of omission by the provider. So our condition on complaints will require providers to have in place a process and to make that visible and make learners aware of it. The other two conditions to just touch on briefly. One is on our condition on the Welsh language, which relates to our duty to promote Welsh medium and the use of Welsh more broadly, and that will require funded providers to have in place a Welsh strategy that will set out how they will increase demand for participation in Welsh medium, along with generally how they will promote the use of Welsh across the provider. And then finally, there is also a learner protection plan condition, but I think it's really important to set out some context on this. The intention behind the learner protection plan condition isn't that everyone develops in advance learner protection plans. It is a vehicle through which, if there is a significant change that means learners are at risk of not being able to complete their course, or at least in the way that they would have expected to achieve the outcomes of the course, we have the ability, if we feel it necessary, to require a provider to develop a learner protection plan. What's set out in the consultation are the types of events in which we may think it necessary to ask for a learner protection plan and what would go in a learner protection plan. But I think the key thing to note is, and this is clear in the guidance, it's not the case that every single situation that kind of gets flagged to us requires a plan. It starts with the conversation, and then it may be the case the Medr feels a plan is required to protect the learner interest in a specific situation. So that's what's set out in the consultation. Those are the 6 new conditions from our area. We have the conditional leads on the course. If you do have specific questions, we can get into those in a moment. But I think just to reiterate, with adult community learning, one of the main things for us is to understand and try and see how we can take that proportional approach that you set out at the start of the session, recognising, I think, that some of this provision is very small and the resources and capacities of providers are often equivalently small too. But any comments or questions? Vicky.
Thanks, Kieran. I don't think essentially I've got any issue with the conditions, either, for adult learning or post-16, but I suppose what I would be looking for from a local authority perspective is that assurance that that open conversation which we're having around these also extends to the discussions around the specific funding streams for each area, because I think, from where I'm sitting, whilst we might all want to have a will to meet those high level conditions, I think from our point of view, some of the funding restrictions make that difficult. So I think, I know they're separate. This is about regulation and then you've got funding, but I would want to be assured that those conversations were happening within Medr as well, so that we can really have that full open discussion about how collectively we can meet those ambitions.
So our strategic plan does set out, and actually this is neither you nor my area, but our strategic plan does set out a commitment to consult on a funding review, and the sort of first step towards that review is a consultation on funding principles, which I think we are expecting to be next calendar year, possibly later into the calendar year. So I think, just to reassure you, that wider consideration of the role of funding in the funding system, those are commitments set out in our strategic plan.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think it's just the challenge is what you've articulated there, is that there is a lag between the conversations now about the principles and, regulatory requirements coming in, and actually the conversation about the funding to be able to deliver on that is delayed. And I think that's probably, from a local authority perspective, that's not helpful, because, we're all trying to grapple with the terms and conditions of the funding and how we use that. And I think, there are some historical things in the funding, from previously when it was under Welsh Government that, we need to have those conversations with about now, so that we are best placed to be able to deliver on those ambitions. So that's my plea, really.
Thank you, Vicky. Any other comments on this area in relation to the breadth of the conditions as they relate to ACL? I look to my colleagues. Is there anything I have forgotten or that I have got horrendously wrong that you want to correct me on? Okay, I think we'll go to the next agenda item, Ewan, which I think is back to you.
Yep. Okay, thank you, Kieran. So I just wanted to say a little bit about monitoring, and Kieran's mentioned about sort of the need to be proportionate, and particularly with ACL, where we're very conscious that we're not talking about huge amounts of money. And actually, when I think about proportionality and risk, some of the things we are thinking about in our consideration about monitoring are the amount of public funds involved and the potential risk to learners. So we have to weigh those sorts of points, and also reputational risk to the tertiary education sector in Wales. So all of those are things which we weigh up in our minds when we think about the kind of extent of any ask on the sector. So in terms of monitoring, I don't intend to sort of split this down by sort of ACL and school sixth form, but I mean the kind of broad principles really about how we're going to monitor and the kind of mechanisms. So in terms of how we are going to monitor compliance, so one of the key tools we're going to use is an annual assurance return. So this is basically a kind of a document which would be completed on an annual basis and signed off by the governing body of the provider. In this case, that would be within your own governance structure as a local authority, and that annual assurance return will be a number of sort of high-level statements, effectively sort of saying that you're complying with the various conditions, and then there would be potentially some evidential requirements that sort of sit behind that. Now, the precise detail of what an annual assurance return looks like will obviously depend on the kinds of providers we're looking at. We've got a lot of experience of doing this with HE and to a lesser extent with FE, where, I mean, with HE, it's very well established, and yes, the new annual assurance return template we're likely to use will be slightly different to what's happened before, because obviously it's a new regulatory framework, but the kind of broad thrust of it will be similar. For yourselves, I think the key point is making a template that works for you, and that, you know, the kind of the information we require as part of that monitoring process is not just totally disproportionate and, you know, hugely burdensome. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space over the next sort of few months, really. So I'd say after we've got this regulatory framework more or less bottomed out, it'll be from there on in sort of, okay, so what does it look like on the ground in terms of how we monitor it? So I think you can expect probably some invites to kind of workshops or whatever in due course to try and sort of work on that, because I think we really do need your input. I certainly don't want to be in a position where we're kind of putting in place a monitoring arrangement which kind of being done to you. I'd want something which we know that you're content with, and that is kind of, you know, broadly proportionate. And in that we have to kind of balance, you know, our strategic duties and statutory duties as a regulator, and we have to report on certain things to Welsh ministers. It's balancing that against the kind of level of burden that any system will put on those who are being regulated, and you know, I'm very conscious that you know, no one really likes being regulated. It's just one of those things. It's like death and taxes. So we are where we are, and we have to have a system. We just need to make it work for everyone involved, I think. So that has to be collaborative. In terms of other kind of elements of the monitoring system, so you've got the annual assurance return, and as I say, that's kind of broadly just an annual process. On top of that, you know, there will be self-evaluations potentially in certain areas. Some of the conditions require self-evaluations. Some of that will be stuff we don't see. It'll be stuff that we'd expect people to undertake themselves as part of normal process, and some of it may be things which we ask for as part of a requirements in respect of a particular condition, and it very much does depend on the condition. And then there'll be other kind of documents which will be standard, you know, sort of financial documents and what have you, which you'll have anyway. Clearly there'll be ESTIN inspections, which will be happening anyway. And then there'll be other independent sources of assurance potentially, and that could be from a number of areas. It could be information from another regulator, for example. It could, I mean, and you know, who knows, it could be absolutely anything. You know, in the past we've had dealings with people over information related to fire safety, for example. So it could be anything really, and you know, clearly something like that would link with the governance and management conditions. So or it could be information from auditors, for example, as well. So potentially any number of sources of independent assurance. In addition, you know, performance data, so published data, which, as we've already touched on, is stuff which we have anyway. But yes, we will be looking at measures. And I suppose engagement with providers could potentially be possible. I mean, I think it's a little bit different with school sixth forms. I can't imagine we're going to be doing that much direct engagement with, you know, over 100 schools, but there may be some sort of group type sessions that we talked before about maybe training for governing bodies. But I think we'd need to sort of get at the sector on a group basis, I would think. But in terms of actual monitoring, I think probably that's less of an important area for schools. It's probably going to be more ad hoc when something goes wrong, I would imagine. And then, you know, we're talking of things go wrong, complaints. So we do get complaints about providers. So that is a space where certainly we could receive information. And then, you know, providers themselves. So it could be yourselves. It could be that school sixth forms might decide to report to us an issue via our reportable events or serious incidents process. So that's the kind of broad range of mechanisms through which we would monitor. Most in terms of actual burden on yourselves, I mean, the assurance return obviously requires a bit of administration behind that. A lot of the rest of it is kind of stuff which happens anyway, to be honest. And I think the key challenge for us will be making sure that in the round, it doesn't place too much burden on yourselves. And clearly the point about school sixth forms, we've got a bit of thinking to do there about particularly with the learner engagement code, for example, which is their statutory duty, how we kind of monitor that, whether we do that directly with the sixth forms or whether somehow it comes through yourselves. But we really do need no expectation in that space at the moment. We do need to have a think about that. I think the key thing is that we get to a space where whatever the arrangements on the ground for look like for monitoring, that you're happy with them and they work for everyone. So that's broadly where we are in terms of monitoring. A lot still up in the air in terms of the operational side of it. I think the key thing is a plea really for you to kind of engage with us going forward on that, and you know, we will clearly want to work with you. I think that was probably all I was going to say in that space. We've already briefly touched on the provider risk assessment process, which we're currently working on. And I think that may well inform where we focus. I mean, I think as a regulator, we want to focus on the areas of greatest risk. We have a limited bandwidth. There are only so many of us in the organization. I think going forward, I mentioned before about public funds being one driver of risk, and it's sort of in that context, adult and community learning is not a huge amount of money compared to some of the other areas. So actually is probably, you know, on that basis, you could argue it's probably of lesser risk, and therefore we should be proportionate and probably ask for a bit less. Clearly, though, you know, we have to weigh against every learner something which, you know, were something to go wrong for an individual learner, that is clearly important for them. But in terms of the overall impact on, you know, the majority of learners, adult community learning is kind of quite small, but no less important. So we have a balance there. And I think the key thing is that we work with you to make sure we hit the sweet spot on that balance, that we're not kind of overburdening you, but we do get the assurances we need, because, you know, there is still some public money involved, and there are still learners who would be affected were something to go wrong. So I'd like to sort of open up for questions now on monitoring. Gail.
Less of a question and more of an observation. If I put my head teacher hat on, which I haven't long removed, then I suppose I just think about the head teacher who's in the middle of all of this, with the quals changes as well, and then this coming at them at the same time, that we need to manage that really carefully.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's just a comment for us all to consider.
No, I appreciate that, and I mean, I think as a regulator, we have a duty to be pragmatic and kind of reasonable. I mean, if we're not reasonable, you could take us to judicial review anyway. But you know, I think as a general principle, you know, I mean, what I haven't talked about today is our values as an organisation, but that clearly underpins the way we want to work. You know, we want to be collaborative and work with you rather than kind of do stuff to you. So I think, you know, it's very important that we do listen to you, and that, you know, kind of the approach we take, you know, we recognize there is a context to everything that's going on, and you know, this is not happening in a vacuum, you know. So and that's the same actually across the whole of the tertiary sector. There's kind of, you'll be aware from the press, there's all sorts of stuff going on with reorganizations in FE, for example, and HE. So yeah, I mean, I think we always have to be conscious of the context when in here. So, you know, whilst, you know, we are a regulator and we do have duties, we're kind of reasonable people, and I think as a, you know, as a kind of principle, we always want to act like that. So yeah, point noted, Gail. Sorry, very long-winded answer, but any other questions? Stunned you into silence. Okay. Any of my colleagues got anything they wanted to raise on monitoring? I think of it, specifics.
If I suppose just say if anything occurs to people after the meeting, do feel free to get in touch. I'm sure we can share. I can see Cleo already has, but we can share some of our general inboxes, so you can follow up if things come to mind afterwards.
Yeah. If you've got any sort of regulatory questions, please, the regulation advice mailbox, I've just put it in the chat if you want to drop us a line. Yes, if you've got any specifics on learner engagement, the learner engagement email address is there as well. Thanks, Marion. What I would say is, this is not the end of a process. This is kind of the start of a process, really, because this is the framework. And the framework is only the kind of thing we work to, and all the kind of the ways of working that sit under that have still got to be worked through. So we definitely will be kind of working with you. But please, if you've got questions, just don't hold back. We're more than happy to answer them. Or if you want another conversation one-to-one, happy for people to drop a line and we'll set up a Teams call. More than happy to do that. And as colleagues have mentioned, tomorrow we have a session with school sixth forms. Am I right in saying local authorities involved in that as well, Marion? Yes.
They are.
And then we've got another one. I think it's on the 8th as well. Is that right? So yeah, you'll be hearing more of this, no doubt. But yeah, if you want to have a further conversation, please get in touch. And if it's something you just don't quite get, just please. Just ask, because I mean, we want to get to the stage where you're all kind of happy with what we're talking about, and that you're clear on what the expectations are. And if we're not clear, you need to tell us, and we can have the conversation. So is the next item is any other business? It feels like a committee meeting of having any other business, but is there anything anyone else wanted to raise at this stage? Tim.
You possibly know what's coming. I just wanted to to raise the timescales for consultation. I've already outlined in an email to you, but I don't know what it's like for single providers, but certainly for representative networks, a month turnaround is just almost impossible. By the time you've digested, read, digested, and then compiled a response and then shared with the network for comments, had those back in, made any amendments, then you have to send for translation and then political sign-off. As a result, the regulatory consultation is currently live, has slipped through my net. I didn't even see it. So I doubt you'll probably get a response from us on that. Although we have managed to share a draft on the learner engagement code. I haven't had any comments on that yet, but we will have something from local government on that. So it's just to flag again. As you say, I know we've had email dialogue about it, and I don't know if there's anything you can do about that. But in order to have a full input with us, just a month is just not sufficient, really.
So I'm sorry, Tim, I'm not quite sure why it was a month, because this went live on 22nd of October. So you not receive an email from us? That's the
well,
$24,000 question, I suppose.
I'll check back through, but I did clock the learner engagement code one, so I don't know why I didn't the other one, and I can see it's on the website as well. But it's still from the 22nd of October to the 17th of December. Well, it's 2 months, isn't it, that one? So yeah. But
yeah. So what I would say in terms of timescales, we are very tight, and so I would urge people to get it in by the deadline, even if it's not translated and the kind of Welsh follows later on. I know I shouldn't say that, but kind of we informally send us your views or something. But I think the key thing is, look, I mean, if it's a couple of days late or whatever, a few days late, I don't think we're not going to look at it till kind of probably early January, or not in any seriousness. It's not the end of the world. What I would say is we will want to have collated everything sort of once we get seriously into January. We will want to have collated everything and we'll have kind of analysed it. So the sooner you can get it to us, the better. But if it comes in, if you send it, I mean, what I would say is the online system will probably close. But if you send us something to regulation advice, I will promise you now we will look at it. So because we're trying to actively engage with this process. So so whilst the actual survey might not if you send it to that regulation advice, we will look at it. But I would just say a plea that please, if you can get it in before the 17th of December, ideal. If it ends up being a few days later, not the end of the world, but if we're mid-January, we've got a problem because we'll have we might have missed the boat by then. I think the key thing is just have let us know where you're at. I think that's the key thing, and we can have a conversation.
Well,
about
as I say, with the learner engagement code, I think we will get that in time. But I mean, an extension at this time of the year wouldn't be of use anyway, because there wouldn't be personnel around after the 17th with the schools closing for the Christmas period and what have you, and local authority staff taking leave, I guess. But yeah, it's just you will get one in for the learner engagement code, put it that way.
Yeah. So, Rob, sorry, you're on mute, Rob. Sorry.
Apologies. Thanks, you.
That's all right.
Echoing Tim's comments, really, the general consultation somehow slipped through my net as well. So obviously, I'd like to have a discussion not only within the local authority but with our school sixth form heads and heads of six. I'll do as best I can to get stuff back to you. But a separate question around the event, the consultation event on Monday the 8th. Is that a rerun of today's, Ewan, or is it a different agenda?
So I'm going to pass to my colleague Marion, who knows more about that event than me. So, Marion.
So the event on tomorrow and on the 8th are specifically for schools and local authorities, and so they are focusing on the two pieces of regulation that actually impact on schools. So that's the learner engagement code and the quality framework. So it's my team and Cleanad presenting those. So it will just go into more depth on those two areas of the regulatory framework, and in particular be an opportunity for us to actually do some direct engagement with secondary schools, which we've not really done as yet. So no, it won't be a rerun of today. It'll be a narrower and deeper look at those particular areas.
Okay, and we will look at what happened. I don't know why people have not had alert about the consultation. That seems strange because it was published and I think people were emailed, but I don't know what's happened there. Okay, any other questions or points people want to raise before we wrap up? Kieran, is anything you wanted to say by way of closing remarks?
No, that's great. Thank you, everyone. It's been really helpful. And just to reiterate, we want this to be a very collaborative process, and we're here as and when things come up, come and talk to us. Okay, so without further ado, I'll draw it to a close. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. It is much appreciated, and let's keep talking. I think that's the key thing. Thank you, and see you again soon.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye all.